Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a drear November morning, the kind that draped London in a colourless shroud, that I found myself once more seated opposite my friend, Sherlock Holmes, in the familiar lodgings of Baker Street. The fire crackled modestly in the grate, barely keeping the damp at bay, while Holmes, cross-legged upon the settee, perused a slim monograph on ancient Persian ciphers with his usual air of detached intensity. Outside, the fog clung thickly to the window panes, and even the sound of hoof-beats along the street was muffled and distant, as though the city itself were whispering under a veil. It was on such mornings, I had come to learn, that the most curious visitors arrived unannounced, seeking the only man in London, perhaps in all of Europe, who could pierce the fog of their mysteries with the precision of a scalpel. I had long ceased to be surprised by the variety of Holmes's engagements, some whimsical, some grave, but more than a few of them carrying the faint odour of international tension. These were the cases that rarely made the press, for they involved matters too delicate for public consumption. "I believe," I remarked, folding the Times, "we are due a client this morning." Holmes raised an eyebrow, but before he could reply, a brisk knock echoed from the hallway below. "Punctual," he murmured, laying aside the monograph and rising. "And if my instincts are correct, Watson, we are about to become involved in a business where the threads stretch far beyond this foggy little island." Our visitor was a man of perhaps 38 years, his posture upright, his gaze alert, yet his bearing betrayed a strain that years alone could not have wrought. He entered with a slight bow, removing his gloves with mechanical precision before presenting his card. Mr. Kemal Rifat, attaché to the Ottoman Embassy. Holmes gestured toward the armchair nearest the fire, while I fetched the visitor a glass of brandy from the sideboard. The man accepted it with a quiet word of thanks, though his fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. "I have come," he began, his accent crisp and his English flawless, "not in an official capacity, but under instructions nonetheless. The matter I bring to you, Mr. Holmes, is one of extreme sensitivity." Holmes nodded. "Pray proceed, Mr. Rifat. You will find no idle gossip leaves these walls." The attaché leaned forward, lowering his voice. 3 days ago, a military map of great importance vanished from our consulate. It was housed in a secure archive. No forced entry, no damage, no disturbance save its absence. "A map," Holmes echoed, steepling his fingers. "One showing strategic mountain passes in the Balkans," Rifat replied gravely. "If it falls into Austrian or Russian hands, the consequences for our empire, and for Europe, may be dire." "Was anyone outside the diplomatic staff aware of its existence?" "Only a handful," he said. "2 officials had access to the archive, and both deny any wrongdoing." Holmes's expression had grown utterly still, save for the faint flicker of interest in his eyes. He glanced at me briefly before returning his gaze to the visitor. "A theft with no signs of entry," he mused. "Intriguing indeed. Do continue." "The archive room," Mr. Rifat continued, "is within the consulate itself, on Queensgate Terrace. It is kept under lock and key, and only Mr. Celal Erden, our chief clerk, and Mr. Harun Dervish, a junior diplomatic aide, are authorised to access it. Both men are long-standing members of our service and, to my knowledge, beyond reproach." Holmes tapped a forefinger lightly against the arm of his chair. Yet one of them must either be lying or has been deceived. Therein lies the difficulty, the attaché said. The lock shows no tampering. No windows were breached. Nothing else was taken or disturbed. The map itself was kept in a sealed document case. Its disappearance was only noticed during a routine inventory. Holmes's brows knitted. And the document's value, beyond the obvious. Rifat hesitated. It details unmarked mule trails and mountain passes through the Western Balkans, routes that avoid formal checkpoints. In the wrong hands, such information could facilitate an incursion without warning. It was to be reviewed in confidence during an upcoming diplomatic exchange. I felt a chill pass through me, despite the warmth of the fire. Holmes had often spoken of quiet incidents with loud consequences, moments when a single missing envelope might shift the balance of entire nations. Were there any visitors or external agents in the building in the days prior to the discovery? Holmes asked. Yes, said Rifat. A British translator, Miss Eugenia Hargreaves, was brought in to assist with Ottoman English documentation. She worked 2 afternoons, supervised. But I find it difficult to believe she would even be aware of the map's significance. Holmes stood, turning toward the window. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing blurred outlines of the street below. Mr. Rifat, he said slowly, you are quite right to seek discretion. Watson and I shall accompany you to the consulate directly. If this was no common theft, then we must prepare ourselves for an uncommon thief. As we prepared to accompany Mr. Rifat to the consulate, I could not help but feel the weight of what had just passed between us. Unlike the more commonplace crimes that had crossed our threshold, embezzlements, jealous lovers, poisoned chocolates, this case carried the distinct chill of international peril. The words unmarked routes and strategic passes echoed grimly in my thoughts. Holmes, for his part, had become utterly silent, his long fingers interlaced before him, and his eyes half closed in thought. I had come to recognize this posture as the storm before the storm, a quietude that heralded the flash of deduction yet to come. Tell me, Watson, he said at length as we descended the stairs, how many armed regiments could move undetected through a Balkan corridor were they in possession of such a map? An entire division, I should think. Indeed. And yet the map is gone, spirited away from a locked chamber with no visible trace of entry or force. The implications, my dear fellow, are manifold. If the map is in Austrian hands, it may provoke the Russians. If it reaches the Russians, it may rattle Vienna. Either way, we have stumbled into a powder keg. And you believe it was stolen for such purposes? I asked. I believe it was stolen with purpose, which is far more dangerous than greed. The game, as ever, is afoot, Watson. But this one may have nations for pieces. As we stepped into the cab waiting below, I glanced once more at the grey sky above. It seemed to me that the city itself was holding its breath, as though some unseen drama were unfolding upon a stage none dared name aloud. The cab rumbled eastward, wheels clattering on slick cobblestones. Yet neither Holmes nor Mr. Rifat spoke. The attaché sat with hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the passing misted panes, while Holmes remained utterly still, save for the occasional flicker of his eyes. I, too, held my tongue, unwilling to interrupt the machinery of his mind as it turned, sorted and discarded possibilities at a speed and precision I could only admire. At last, as we neared Queen's Gate Terrace, Holmes spoke, not to either of us, but as if complete in a thought aloud. 3 things, he murmured. A locked room, a vanished map, and no signs of trespass. Then, turning sharply to Mr. Riffat, he asked, "You are certain the lock showed no damage?" "None at all," the man replied. "Our locksmith examined it. No scratches, no tampering, no tool marks of any kind." Holmes gave a short, mirthless chuckle. "Then we are left with the most dangerous of adversaries, the invisible hand." As the cab drew to a halt before the elegant facade of the Turkish Consulate, Holmes reached for his hat and gloves. Before stepping out, he turned to me, his voice low but firm. "A theft without a thief," he said, "and a secret without a lock. Curious, Watson, most curious." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the fog like a shadow in pursuit of another. The Turkish Consulate, situated on Queen's Gate Terrace, possessed the quiet grandeur one associates with old embassies: thick carpets, hushed voices, and an ever-present sense that a single, misplaced word could provoke international entanglements. As we stepped inside, a secretary with impassive features ushered us down a corridor that seemed to swallow every footfall in its plush silence. Holmes moved beside me with that peculiar gait of his, not hurried, but imbued with a sort of restrained electricity. He was, I knew, already absorbing every detail: the gleam on the brass fixtures, the thickness of the dust in corners, the tone of the whispered Turkish behind closed doors. We were shown into a modest chamber where Mr. Riffat rejoined us and introduced the chief steward on duty, a man named Idris, whose manner was so formal as to appear almost theatrical. "The archive room is this way, gentlemen," said Riffat. "I've instructed that nothing be touched until Mr. Holmes has had opportunity to examine it." Holmes offered a polite nod, but said nothing. His eyes had already begun their familiar flickering movements, darting from door frame to cornice, pausing briefly on a scuff mark or faint indentation. To most, the consulate would appear pristine. To Holmes, it was already beginning to speak. As we were led deeper into the building, a hush fell about us. It was not simply the silence of manners or function. It was the silence of a place that held secrets behind each closed door. And in that moment, I realized with a curious chill that we had entered not just a consulate, but a theatre of unseen forces, where the stage was set and the actors moved behind veils of diplomacy. The archive chamber was a narrow, high-ceilinged room, lined with mahogany cabinets and bearing the scent of old paper and oil. There were no windows, and the single gas lamp above cast a pale, unwavering glow. A heavy iron door stood open behind us, its lock unblemished and firmly intact. Holmes took no more than a single stride into the room before pausing, his hand reaching instinctively for the small magnifying lens he often carried in the inner pocket of his coat. He crouched, examined the threshold, and then rose with a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. No scratches, no abrasions, a lock that has not been forced. He spoke almost to himself, yet something has passed through here unseen. He moved slowly along the right-hand wall, his eyes sweeping the room. One of the cabinets, marked with an Ottoman seal, had a small metal case atop it. Holmes lifted the case carefully and inspected it, noting a charred mark along the lip of the lid. "Curious," he said. "A burn, localized and sharp. This was no careless accident. Someone lit a match or small flame too close to the edge." I stepped forward to open it. "No," said Holmes. "This was not the result of accessing the case. More likely it was a signal, a cue perhaps. But to whom?" Riffat looked visibly startled. We noticed the mark, but dismissed it. No fire was reported. Holmes made no reply, but instead turned his attention to the far wall, where a large clock stood slightly askew upon its mount. He removed his pocket watch and stared between the two for a long moment. "This clock runs 2 minutes fast," he murmured. "But only this one, yes?" "I believe so," Rifat replied. "Even the flow of time is disturbed in this room," Holmes said, half to himself. "Which means that whoever entered it did so not with violence, but with precision." The room, for all its silence, seemed suddenly alive with implication. We were next introduced to the only two men, besides Mr. Rifat himself, who had access to the locked archive: Mr. Celal Erden, the chief clerk, and Mr. Harun Dervish, a diplomatic aide recently returned from a posting in Vienna. Mr. Erden was a man of middle age, his collar neatly pressed, and his spectacles perched with military precision upon the bridge of his nose. He stood with his hands behind his back and spoke with an accent less refined than Rifat's, but with a quiet pride in his role. "I have served the embassy for 17 years, he said. "I have never once mislaid a document or failed in my duties." His composure, however, wavered beneath Holmes's gaze. There was a tremor in the corner of his mouth, and when he spoke of the archive's security procedures, his voice grew tight with nervous repetition. "Your loyalty is not in question," Holmes said calmly, "but you will understand that procedure, no matter how rigorous, is of little comfort when a ghost has walked through your locked door." We were then introduced to Mr. Dervish, a younger man, immaculately dressed, with eyes that measured us all in a single glance. He smiled as he greeted Holmes, but there was something faintly theatrical in the gesture. "I understand, Mr. Holmes, that you are to make sense of nonsense," he said smoothly. "A most enviable skill." "I do my best," Holmes replied, unamused. Dervish maintained an elegant poise, answering questions with precision but offering little beyond the surface. When Holmes inquired about his recent return from Vienna, he deflected with a quip about weather and formal receptions. Holmes, however, lingered on the man for a moment too long. "A diplomat," he said later as we exited the room, "is paid to lie with grace, but Dervish does so with pleasure, which makes him altogether more dangerous." Rifat looked uneasy. "You suspect him?" "I suspect what he has not said," Holmes replied, "and what his manner is trying very hard to conceal." Though our interviews yielded little in substance, Holmes's expression had not soured in the least. If anything, it had grown more absorbed, his gaze sharpening as though the very air of the consulate whispered secrets only he could hear. He returned to the archive chamber, where the cabinet and the burned document case awaited further scrutiny. "Observe closely, Watson," he murmured, bending once again over the metal edge. "The scorched line is not the result of careless proximity to flame. It is intentional. The point of origin is narrow and precise, an instantaneous burst, not a lingering heat." "A signal," I ventured. "Possibly," he said, "or a message. But to whom? And for what purpose? A match struck here. Hurriedly, I should say, and not for illumination. The room has gaslight. No man strikes a match when flame is already at hand, unless it is meant to be seen." He moved toward the corner opposite the cabinets, sniffed the air, and raised his head slightly. "Do you detect it, Watson?" A faint trace, floral, delicate. I inhaled. "Something like jasmine." "Precisely," said Holmes. "An exotic perfume, uncommon here but frequently worn by ladies in the Eastern Mediterranean. It is fresh, less than 48 hours old." I glanced toward the corridor beyond. "Then Miss Hargreaves—" "Maybe more than a translator," he said. "Or at the very least, more than she appears." He then returned to the clock mounted on the far wall and removed his watch again. "It gains 2 minutes," he said. "Only this clock, and only in this room. Either it was altered intentionally, or it is a defect long unnoticed. He stared at it in silence for a moment, then turned to me. When time itself lies, Watson, one must ask, whose hand turned it? For in altering a clock, one leaves not merely a clue, but a motive. We had scarcely stepped beyond the threshold of the archive room when my eye caught upon a curious object lying near the base of the skirting board, half shadowed by the leg of a small side table in the hallway. I stooped to retrieve it. It was a feather, black, slender, and strangely elegant. Not the crude shape of a pigeon's plume, nor the heavy pinions of a crow. This was something altogether finer. "Holmes," I said, holding it out. "Have a look at this." He took the feather between thumb and forefinger, turning it beneath the light with a frown of interest. "Not a writing quill," he muttered. "Too soft at the base, and too long for ordinary bird plumage of this region. Intriguing. You don't suppose it simply blew in from the street?" "Unlikely," Holmes replied. "No windows open nearby. And look here, no dust along the stem. It has not lain here long, perhaps minutes." Mr. Rifat, who had rejoined us, looked from the feather to Holmes with an air of growing concern. That is not from our offices," he said firmly. "We use standard goose quills for ceremonial correspondence. I have never seen such a feather before." Holmes tapped the edge of the table where the feather had lodged. "If this was dropped by accident," he said, "it is the sort of accident that betrays the hand of its owner. A careless spy is the rarest of creatures, Watson, but the most useful." He placed the feather carefully in his pocket. "It is a thread," he added quietly, "and if we follow it, it may yet lead us through this tapestry of silence and half-truths." The name Miss Eugenia Hargrave had been mentioned only once, and in passing, but that was quite enough to secure her a place in Holmes's mind. By the time we returned to Baker Street that evening, her presence hovered over our discussion like a spectre newly introduced to the stage. "She was brought in to assist with document translation, yes?" Holmes asked, seated once more before the fireplace. "2 days prior to the map's disappearance?" "According to Mr. Rifat," I replied, "she had no unsupervised access, worked in a shared space, and never entered the archive chamber." Holmes gave a soft grunt. "Then she's either blameless or brilliantly situated." I raised an eyebrow. "You suspect her?" "I suspect what is left out of her narrative," he said. "The presence of a foreign perfume in a locked room, a feather from an uncommon bird, and now a translator with no record beyond a temporary assignment. That, Watson, is a pattern emerging in the shadow." Later that evening, Holmes dispatched a telegram to a contact at the Foreign Office and requested any available documentation on Miss Hargrave. While we waited, he reviewed her known movements during her consulate sessions and compared them to the window of the map's last known appearance. "The timing is exquisite," he murmured. "She concludes her work the very day before the document vanishes, and no one thought to question her, because her role was deemed too peripheral to matter." "Then you believe she may have taken the map?" Holmes looked at me with that familiar gleam of reserve and amusement. "I believe, my dear Watson, that Miss Hargrave did something. The question is not whether she committed the theft, but whether she knows who did." And with that, the web tightened just a little further. At Holmes's instruction, I took it upon myself the following morning to pay a discreet visit to Miss Eugenia Hargrave's residence, a modest second-floor flat on Gower Street, not far from the British Museum. She answered the door herself, dressed plainly, with an air of quiet self-possession that I found both composed and impenetrable. "Dr. Watson?" she asked, not surprised in the least. "You are Mr. Holmes's companion, I believe." "Indeed," I said. I hope I do not intrude." "Not at all," she replied, "though I imagine this is not a social call." She invited me in, and I found her surroundings tidy to the point of austerity. A shelf of language texts lined one wall. A solitary pot of tea steamed faintly on the hearth. I explained our investigation in general terms and referenced the events at the consulate. She listened without interruption, her face unmoving save for the occasional narrowing of the eyes. "I assisted with diplomatic correspondence," she said at last. "Nothing more. I was never left alone, and I certainly had no access to any maps." "Do you recall anyone behaving oddly during your time there?" She hesitated. "Mr. Dervish asked more questions than seemed necessary, but he is a diplomat. Perhaps that is his nature." "And your perfume, Miss Hargrave?" "Jasmine." She blinked once, barely perceptibly. "A gift from my brother. He returned from Smyrna last year. Do you accuse me of something, Doctor?" "Not at all," I said gently. "Only that you may be closer to this matter than you realize. I assure you I am not." And yet, as I took my leave, I could not help but notice the faint trace of defensiveness behind her poise, like tension behind a painted screen. She had answered every question, but not, I thought, every suspicion. Upon my return to Baker Street, Holmes greeted my account of Miss Hargrave with narrowed eyes and a brief nod, though he posed no immediate conclusion. Instead, he turned our attention to the map itself, not as a stolen object, but as an artifact of political consequence. "We must understand," he said, "not only who might take the map, but why. And to answer that, we must trace its origins." He had already begun to compile references from diplomatic memoranda, drawing upon his personal index of obscure political occurrences, which I had long known to rival the archives of Whitehall. Among these papers was a note identifying the point of initial reception: the confidential delivery of the map during an Ottoman envoy's visit to the country estate of one Sir Edward Grantham, a former envoy to Constantinople. "The courier was hosted at Grantham's manor 3 months past," Holmes said. "The map changed hands there under cover of a formal dinner and private consultations. Few were present, and few are still aware of what passed." "Then the theft may have roots reaching back to that visit," I suggested. "Precisely. A seed planted then may only now have borne its fruit. Theft is not always sudden. It may be cultivated with care." I remarked upon the peculiarity of Sir Edward's name never having surfaced in our previous inquiries. Holmes nodded. "Too prominent to suspect," he said. "And yet, he occupies a perfect vantage point, known to both sides, but belonging to neither." He paused, then tapped the arm of his chair. "We go to Richmond tomorrow. I should like a word with Sir Edward Grantham." And so it was arranged. A telegram was sent, and we received a courteous invitation for the following afternoon. Holmes said little more that evening, but I could sense the energy coiling beneath his stillness. The deeper he delved into the matter, the more it ceased to be a simple theft, and began to resemble a puzzle with borders yet undefined. Sir Edward Grantham received us at his Richmond estate with the air of a man accustomed to formality and performance in equal measure. He was tall, lean, and meticulously groomed, with a voice that carried the unassailable confidence of the diplomatic class. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, I was rather surprised to receive your inquiry," he said as he ushered us into a modest sitting room filled with mementos of Eastern service, ink-stained maps, Turkish antiques, and a framed letter bearing the Sultan's seal. "Surprise," said Holmes, "is often the first step to truth." Sir Edward smiled at the remark, though his eyes remained unamused. "You believe your investigation intersects with my affairs?" With the movement of a particular document, Holmes replied. A map of strategic consequence first passed through your house 3 months ago. Sir Edward's expression did not change. I recall the dinner, of course, a cordial affair, but I had no dealings with any military documents. Yet your guests did. To my knowledge, such materials never left their hands. Holmes examined a carved paperweight on the desk before continuing. Were all your staff present that evening? My butler and housekeeper, yes. No other guests. And since then, any visitors from the consulate? Sir Edward hesitated. Mr. Dervish paid a visit 2 weeks ago. Strictly social, or so I was told. He brought a bottle of Reiki and discussed Viennese opera. Is that suspicious, Mr. Holmes? Holmes offered a faint smile. The only thing I find suspicious, Sir Edward, is the absence of anything suspicious. We left shortly thereafter, the interview polite but unfruitful, at least on the surface. Yet as we descended the gravel path, Holmes turned to me, his eyes bright beneath the brim of his hat. There is a quality to Sir Edward's calm, Watson, he said. Not the calm of innocence, but the caution of a man who knows exactly how much not to say. It was well after midnight when Holmes and I returned to Sir Edward Grantham's estate, not as guests, but as silent observers. Holmes had remained contemplative since our earlier visit, and when the moon rose clear above the treetops, he announced, with quiet finality, that we should pay the grounds one final visit, uninvited. The garden path was soft beneath our feet, dampened by the evening dew, and the surrounding foliage shivered faintly in the windless air. We moved without speaking, guided by Holmes's instinct alone, until he halted abruptly near the eastern wing of the manor. There, he whispered, pointing toward a low-set window. It belonged to the library. The drapes were drawn, yet the faintest sliver of yellow light bled from within. Holmes crouched near the sill and studied the soil beneath. Footprints, he murmured. Fresh, narrow-heeled, likely a woman or a man of delicate build. I knelt beside him. The impressions were unmistakable. The soil had not yet dried, and the edges of the prints were crisp. Holmes produced a tape and measured the spacing. Shorter stride than average. Not a hurried gait, but deliberate. This was not a thief fleeing with haste. It was someone returning to a place they knew. He turned toward the hedge bordering the garden path and examined the ground beneath it. There, nearly hidden in the underbrush, lay a discarded glove, black, silk, and bearing a faint monogram. E.H. Eugenia Hargreaves, I breathed. Quite so, said Holmes. Her denial grows more curious by the hour. He peered once more toward the library window. And yet, no alarm, no servant stirring. Whoever entered tonight did so with confidence, and unless Sir Edward has taken up midnight strolls in women's gloves, I dare say our translator has returned to the scene of something more than conversation. Holmes rose, his features taut with purpose. Come, Watson, let us see what ghosts haunt this library by lamplight. We found the library door ajar, its lock unbroken, as though left that way by design. Holmes gestured for silence and entered first, his footsteps soundless on the thick rug. I followed close behind, and for a moment we stood in stillness, surrounded by darkened shelves and the scent of old leather and faint tobacco. It was Holmes who moved first, drifting toward the corner nearest the hearth. He dropped to one knee and examined the tiles. Then, with a low murmur, he drew a small envelope from his coat and used it to scoop a smudge of ash into its folds. Turkish tobacco, he said softly. Half smoked and recently so. The ash is still warm. Perhaps no more than an hour has passed. A coincidence, I asked. Sir Edward may simply enjoy such blends. Sir Edward, Holmes replied, smokes cigars, not hand-rolled cigarettes. There is no humidor here, and no ashtray suited to the length of this residue. He then turned to the writing desk. The drawers were shut, the papers aligned, yet Holmes's hands moved with precision, touching nothing, but reading everything. There is nothing overt here, he said, but the order is too perfect. The absence of chaos is itself the evidence. I glanced again toward the hearth. Then Miss Hargreaves returned to this room. Or never truly left it, Holmes murmured. He straightened and looked toward the window once more. She knew something, Watson, something that compelled her to return, to verify, to retrieve, or perhaps to hide. And what of Dervish? Holmes's eyes narrowed. If he too visited this room recently, then their secrets may be shared, or their betrayals mutual. He looked down at the faint ring of ash once more. One thing is certain, Watson. Someone is playing both sides of this board, and they are growing bolder by the hour. We left Sir Edward's estate under cover of darkness, Holmes unusually quiet as we travelled by hansom back toward the city. His gaze fixed on some middle distance, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Signs, I had come to learn, of a mind working at relentless speed beneath a still surface. Watson, he said at last, how much credence do you place in the gossip of diplomatic corridors? Very little, I replied, unless it passes through your filter first. He allowed a faint smile. Then you shall find this tidbit provocative. I received word this morning, through a source whose reliability I would trust over my own eyesight, that Harun Dervish has previously drawn the attention of Austrian intelligence. I turned to him with surprise. Surely you do not mean he is an agent? Not formally, Holmes said. But there are indications that he served, shall we say, in a cooperative capacity. While posted in Vienna, he was known to frequent certain salons where the company was less Ottoman than Austro-Hungarian. Espionage, then, I asked. Influence, Holmes corrected. Subtle, insinuating, unofficial, yet unmistakable. And such men, Watson, do not cease their affiliations merely because their address has changed. I felt a chill that owed nothing to the evening air. Then the theft was not only an act of betrayal, Holmes finished, but possibly of allegiance. And now consider the chain. Dervish gains proximity to the consulate. A map vanishes. Miss Hargreaves, the unassuming translator, is found near the scene, and the scent of her perfume lingers in a room where only silence was meant to dwell. And Sir Edward? I asked. Holmes's gaze sharpened. A man who knows how to remain untouched, but no man, no matter how refined, is free of consequence if he stands too near the fire. The shadows in London seemed to thicken as we passed beneath the street lamps, and I could not escape the sense that we were approaching not merely the heart of a mystery, but the edge of something altogether more perilous. The following morning brought a chill unlike any London fog could conjure. I had just finished breakfast when a sharp knock rattled the door below. Mrs. Hudson, flustered, appeared moments later to announce that an urgent message had arrived, delivered by hand from the Turkish Consulate. Holmes tore it open with a surgeon's precision, read the contents once, then passed it silently to me. It was from Mr. Rifat. Mr. Selal Erden was found unconscious in his quarters late last night. A note was pinned to his chest. I have enclosed a copy of the message. The situation has grown grave. Please advise at once. KR. Below this, transcribed in block lettering, was the note. Silence preserves peace. Holmes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A threat? I asked. A warning, he replied. And not merely to Erden, This was a message to all parties, ourselves included. Within the hour, we were at Mr. Erden's apartment in South Kensington. A constable stood at the door, already under instruction not to speak to the press. The room was small and spare, the furnishings unremarkable. Erden lay pale upon the bed, a physician attending him. He had been struck on the back of the head. Blunt force, the doctor believed, but not with intent to kill. Deliberate restraint, Holmes said, observing the scene. Whoever delivered the blow meant to frighten, not finish. Mr. Riffat met us in the corridor. His face was drawn, his voice low. The note was attached by a brass pin to his waistcoat. No one entered by force. His keys were untouched. Then the assailant had access, Holmes murmured. Or was permitted entry. Mr. Holmes, Riffat said, if this matter escalates further, it could rupture more than careers. The ambassador himself is aware now. He wants it buried. Holmes nodded. Unfortunately, the ground in which this matter lies is already disturbed. If we do not uncover the truth soon, Mr. Riffat, someone else may do so for us, and not as gently. As we departed, Holmes paused in the stairwell. 3 warnings, Watson. The burnt match, the feather, and now this. They are escalating, and somewhere beneath them lies a single truth, quiet and coiled like a serpent. Holmes had always possessed a flair for theatrics, but it was in moments of strategic deceit that he revealed his truest brilliance. That afternoon, he sat with pen in hand and wrote, in his most legible script, a telegram addressed to Mr. Riffat, though never intended for delivery. Map recovered. Safe return to consulate scheduled for tomorrow at noon. Please prepare reception room for diplomatic handoff. He passed it to me with a faint smile. A simple fiction, Watson, but one which may set the spider stirring in its web. You expect them to take the bait? I expect they cannot afford not to. Whoever removed that map did so with a purpose, and they must now suspect the recovery means their end is near. Desperation reveals what caution conceals. The telegram was handed over at the nearest station, with instructions for it to be copied and routed via routine consular protocol, ensuring that the message would become known to every eye it passed, including, Holmes presumed, the guilty one. Truth, he remarked, often travels with difficulty. Lies, on the other hand, move freely. As evening fell, he sat by the fire, unmoving, but for the occasional glance at the mantel clock. We must be at the consulate by 10, he said. I trust you've brought your revolver. I have, I replied. Do you anticipate danger? I anticipate surprise, which is often more perilous. But fear not, Watson, we shall not confront shadows unarmed. And so it was that we prepared ourselves, not with force, but with fiction. Holmes, it seemed, was about to spring a trap, baited not with evidence, but with imagination. At precisely 10 minutes past 10, we arrived once more at the Turkish Consulate. The building, though formally closed, had been made available to Holmes by private agreement with Mr. Riffat, who, though not fully apprised of our strategy, understood the necessity of discretion. Holmes had come disguised, not in the crude theatrical manner of false beards and rubber noses, but in the simple livery of a night cleaner. With a mop pail, cloth satchel, and a uniform borrowed from one of the consulate's service staff, he moved without notice through the rear entrance. I waited in the corridor outside the archive room, revolver concealed beneath my coat, every nerve tuned to a silence that thickened by the minute. The plan, Holmes had explained, was brutally simple. A sealed envelope, resembling the stolen map's casing in weight and size, would be left within the cabinet, in the very place from which the original had vanished. The telegram would do the rest. 10 minutes later, Holmes emerged from the archive chamber. His expression was calm, but I could detect a spark of anticipation behind the dull shine of his uniform cap. "It is done," he whispered. "The envelope has been placed, the cabinet locked, and the room left as we found it. And now?" "Now," he said, glancing toward the dim hallway. "We wait." We withdrew into a side office with an unobstructed view of the archive room door. A single gas lamp burned low. The consulate was utterly still. "Tell me, Watson," Holmes said softly, "what is more dangerous? A man with something to lose, or one who believes it is already lost?" Before I could answer, his hand touched my sleeve. "Footsteps," he said. And in that moment, the silence broke. The door to the archive creaked open, just a sliver, slow and cautious. A slender figure slipped inside, shrouded in darkness but lit, for a breathless second, by the flickering gas lamp in the hall. Holmes was already on his feet before the door closed again. We moved swiftly, Holmes ahead of me, silent as breath itself, and I close behind with a revolver drawn. As we entered the archive, the figure froze, caught in the act of opening the cabinet drawer. "Do not move," Holmes said quietly. The intruder turned, and to my astonishment, it was Miss Eugenia Hargreaves. She did not scream, nor faint. Instead, she looked at Holmes with wide, stunned eyes and said, in a voice that trembled with something far more complex than fear, "You weren't supposed to know." Holmes stepped forward, and yet I did. I knew the moment I saw the ash and the jasmine. "I didn't take it for myself," she said. "I took it to keep it from him." "Harun Dervish?" Holmes asked. Her silence was confirmation enough. He moved closer, his tone low but precise. "You passed the map to him, didn't you? Under pressure. Perhaps blackmail. And then, when you learned what he truly was, you tried to undo your part. Where is the original?" Her shoulders sagged. "Hidden, in a book, at Sir Edward's house. He never knew." Holmes gave a single nod. "You must come with us. But fear not. Truth, even late, is better than silence forever." As we escorted her from the room, I glanced at Holmes. "You suspected her all along?" "No," he replied, "but I suspected the one who tried too hard to appear innocent." And outside, the wind had begun to rise. Once seated in the small chamber adjacent to the consulate's records room, Miss Hargreaves seemed to shed the last remnants of resistance. Her gloved hands trembled. Her voice, though composed, carried the weight of something long suppressed. "I was not meant for this world, Doctor." "Watson," she said. "Not for espionage, not for betrayal. I only meant to assist with translations. I had no notion what lay beneath the surface." Holmes said nothing, only leaned forward, his grey eyes fixed with unwavering attention. "I met Mr. Dervish some months ago," she continued. "He was charming, eloquent, so very knowledgeable. I suppose I was flattered. He said he needed help understanding some archival terms from the Ottoman reforms. Nothing more." "And you agreed?" Holmes asked. She nodded. "At first, it was merely linguistic. But then he pressed further. Phrases I'd seen in classified maps, symbols I knew from my translation work. It was subtle, always indirect, but soon I realized I had given him pieces he had no right to possess." "And the map?" I prompted gently. She closed her eyes. "He convinced me to retrieve it. He said it was a safeguard, that he feared it would fall into Russian hands. I believed him, Mr. Holmes, I truly did. I handed it over. And then," Holmes asked quietly, "I found out what he truly was," she whispered. "A loyalist to Vienna, not a patriot, not even a neutral, He was selling pieces of the empire to the highest bidder. "So you acted," Holmes said. "I stole the map back," she replied. "He never realized. I hid it inside a hollowed book, Memoirs of a Diplomat in Constantinople, at Sir Edward's manor. He never noticed. He still believes he has it." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Your courage may yet undo the damage you were pulled into." "I only hope," she murmured, "that it is not too late." And Holmes, his voice low and cold, answered, "If he comes tonight, it may yet be just in time." We had scarcely returned to the observation room when the bell near the rear entrance gave a muted chime. One of the night stewards appeared moments later, whispering a single name: "Mr. Haroun Dervish." Holmes straightened instantly. "Watson, remain here with Miss Hargrave. I shall meet our guest." The tension in the room was taut as piano wire. Through a narrow slit in the wall, I could observe Holmes stepping into the dim corridor just as Dervish entered from the opposite end. He was immaculately dressed as ever, his expression one of calm curiosity. "I was told," he said, "that something urgent required my presence." Holmes offered no greeting. "You came for the envelope." Dervish blinked. "Envelope? Do not insult us further," Holmes said, stepping closer. "You received word the map had been recovered. You came to reclaim it, not as an official, but as an agent." Dervish's composure slipped for the briefest moment. "Mr. Holmes, such accusations have been confirmed," Holmes interrupted. "Your connections in Vienna, your manipulation of Miss Hargrave, your presence at Sir Edward's manor 2 weeks ago. I've spoken to the coachman who drove you, unofficially, discreetly, and with payment." For the first time, Dervish looked genuinely rattled. "You have no proof." Holmes's voice was ice. "No. You'll find the decoy envelope untouched in the archive chamber. You would have taken it tonight had Miss Hargrave not retrieved the real map before you. You were played, Mr. Dervish." The diplomat's hands clenched at his sides. "You have no authority to detain me." "No," Holmes agreed. "But the British Foreign Office does, and they are quite eager to question a man whose embassy tours coincide with the disappearance of confidential military documents." At that moment, Mr. Riffat appeared at the far end of the corridor, flanked by 2 plainclothes men from the Home Office. Dervish turned pale. Holmes looked on, unblinking. "The game," he said softly, "has ended." Later that evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes stood before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. The glow lit the edges of his profile, but his expression remained unreadable. "Dervish was never a patriot," he said. "He was a merchant of secrets. Vienna paid well, and he was too clever to steal the map himself. Far better to persuade another to do it, one he could later discard." "Miss Hargrave," I said quietly. "She was the perfect pawn, educated, principled, and entirely unaware of how deep the waters were. When she realized the truth, she did what few would have. She turned back, and in doing so, she complicated everything for him." "And Sir Edward?" Holmes exhaled. "Grantham played the host, but not the conspirator. His estate was used, perhaps knowingly, perhaps not. He was clever enough to keep his name clear of scandal and subtle enough to never quite lie. But he will not be invited to another consulate dinner any time soon." "And the map?" I asked. "Returned," Holmes replied. "And the file closed quietly by the Foreign Office. No arrests, no press, just silence, as always, when diplomacy meets treachery." He turned from the fire and looked at me with a weariness that only surfaced in such matters. "Some cases, Watson, leave no satisfaction, only prevention." I said nothing, for I felt it too. that hollow sense of having won a game whose stakes none would ever publicly acknowledge. And yet, as Holmes sat again and reached for his pipe, I saw a flicker of contentment in his eyes. We had not merely caught a thief, we had unmasked a traitor. It was just past 9 o'clock when we stepped once more into our rooms at Baker Street. The lamps cast a soft amber glow across the bookshelves, and the fire in the grate had been freshly stoked by Mrs. Hudson, though no message had been sent to announce our return. Holmes removed his coat and hung it carefully upon the hook, then stood before the hearth, motionless save for the slow drawing of his breath. I, too, felt the curious fatigue that follows, not from physical exertion, but from the tension of events whose gravity surpasses even one's own comprehension. The affair had played out in shadow, resolved not with applause or arrest, but with silence, discreet acknowledgements and unseen hands closing unseen ledgers. For a long moment, Holmes said nothing. Then he turned and spoke with the calm of one who had already begun to catalogue the affair in his mind. A diplomat who became a merchant of secrets. A clerk struck into silence. A young woman drawn into a web she never understood. And all of it orchestrated by a man whose greatest talent was knowing how little to leave behind. You mean Dervish? Holmes nodded. He played his role with admirable finesse, but even the most careful agents overlook something. In this case, a few somethings. And what of Miss Hargrave? I asked. Will she face consequences? Holmes's voice grew softer. The Foreign Office will ensure she vanishes, but gently. Some disappearances are not punishments, Watson, but reprieves. The fire crackled faintly as Holmes returned to his chair and struck a match. We prevented nothing glorious, he said, but perhaps we prevented something terrible. And in that quiet, I began to write, knowing that this tale, like so many others, would never truly reach the world for which it mattered most. As the fire burned low and the hour turned toward midnight, Holmes began, at last, to lay the pieces upon the table in that fashion of his, which never failed to astonish, no matter how many times I had borne witness to it. You will recall, he said, that our first true clue was not material, but sensory, the scent in the archive. Jasmine, I nodded, an uncommon fragrance in England, distinctly Eastern. At first glance that pointed to Miss Hargrave, but in truth it pointed to two things. Her presence, yes, but also the means by which her presence was hidden. A scent in a sealed room does not linger unless it is fresh, and no one on staff wore it. It was intended to be forgotten, mistaken for something passing. Yet it endured. Precisely because she had returned. She had been in that room again, after the theft. And the match? Holmes reached for the charred document case from the archive. The burn mark was singular, sharp, quick. A match lit in haste, not for light, but as a signal. The angle of the mark told me the match had been struck upward, suggesting a right-handed man who was pressed for time. That narrowed it to Dervish. You said he used it to signal a contact. Likely from within, Holmes said. He was never alone long enough for correspondence. It was a non-verbal cue, perhaps to Miss Hargrave, perhaps to a third party watching from the hall. And the clock? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, yes, the most curious of all. Running 2 minutes fast, but only in the archive. Not by accident, but by intent. A timepiece adjusted just enough to create discrepancy, to manipulate alibis. Dervish ensured that his presence in the room could be justified against a second clock elsewhere. But he forgot the one constant in all timekeeping, Watson. Observation. And yours, I said, was absolute. Not quite, he replied, but sharper than his. Holmes drew the small, sealed envelope from his desk drawer and placed it delicately upon the table. Inside was the slender black feather, unremarkable to the average eye, yet now transformed in my view to the weightiest of clues. "This," he said, "was not shed by accident, Watson. It is the tail plume of the Alpine raven, a species not found in England but commonly used by Austrian diplomatic scribes in their cipher departments." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean it was used as a writing quill?" Holmes nodded. "Not in this instance, no. But the type is emblematic. It is a common token in Vienna among those trained in the Staatssicherheitsschule, Austria's intelligence training division, carried sometimes as a charm, more often as a signature. And Dervish spent considerable time in Vienna. His presence in those circles was not conjecture, it was calculated. And this feather, dropped so carelessly in the hall, was his first mistake. Or perhaps it belonged to an accomplice. Either way, it narrowed our scope dramatically. He paused for a moment, regarding the feather with something close to reverence. "Sometimes," he said, "the most damning evidence is that which appears too delicate to matter." "And yet it mattered more than all the rest," I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "It was a whisper from across an empire, Watson, and in its silence it told me everything." It was 2 days later when Holmes received the briefest of notes from the Turkish delegation, written in Mr. Rifat's unmistakably careful hand. "The item has been recovered. The matter is closed. You have our thanks." There was no mention of the map by name, no flourish of diplomatic gratitude, only that plain coded phrase which confirmed that the game had ended and the pieces returned to their rightful box. Holmes, upon reading it, said nothing. He merely folded the paper, placed it in the fire, and watched it burn. As for Miss Hargreaves, she did not stand trial, nor did she face formal censure. Her role in the affair, though undeniable, had been shaped not by malice, but by manipulation, a point which Holmes made abundantly clear in his private communication to the Foreign Office. And yet, some shadows cannot be entirely cast off. By the week's end, her resignation from the Civil Translation Bureau had been quietly accepted. No farewell function was held. No notice appeared in the public registry. She simply ceased to be. I passed her once more on Gower Street not long after, and though she offered a polite nod, there was in her eyes a weariness that no absolution could erase. Her part in the matter had ended, but not without cost. "She will not return to service," Holmes remarked when I mentioned it. "Some debts are paid not with coin or sentence, but with solitude." And so the wheel turned again. The document restored, the players dismissed, and the theatre of espionage returned to its customary silence. But as Holmes later observed, not all resolutions are quiet because they lack drama. Some are quiet because they cannot be spoken aloud. Harun Dervish did not appear again in London society. His formal position at the consulate was relinquished within 72 hours of the incident. An internal memo from the Turkish mission stated that he had been reassigned to continental affairs, though no destination was provided. Within discreet circles, however, the truth was whispered with greater clarity. He had been handed over, not to the Ottoman authorities, but to British intelligence. No charges were filed, no proceedings were held. There was no trial, nor even an arrest to note. He simply vanished, absorbed into the quiet mechanisms of the state, where men such as Dervish are neither punished nor pardoned, but neutralized. "Exchanges were made," Holmes remarked, "concessions promised, and Dervish, I suspect, will not see the shores of the Bosphorus again." "But why no prosecution?" I asked. Holmes gave a faint smile. Because sometimes, Watson, silence is more useful than spectacle. He is more valuable as a secret than as a headline. And Sir Edward, he has retired from diplomatic hosting, citing a need for rest and discretion. One suspects he has been advised that his hospitality will no longer be required. It was a strange sort of justice, the kind that leaves no trace and claims no victor. But in the world Holmes inhabited, it was often the only kind afforded by governments too entangled to untangle the truth in public. And so Dervish disappeared from the streets, the papers, and even the memories of those who once knew him. But not from ours, for Holmes had seen through his masks, and, in doing so, stripped away a danger that might otherwise have remained dressed in silk and diplomacy. In the quiet days that followed, I often found myself returning to the events of that November, a case that bore no sensational headlines, no courtroom climax, and yet held consequences far weightier than any we had encountered that year. There had been no public applause, no recognition from the Crown or Cabinet. And yet I knew, as surely as I knew Holmes's every habit and nuance, that he had done more than solve a theft. He had, perhaps, preserved a fragile thread of peace. For in that silent room, behind diplomatic curtains and whispered names, he had seen what others could not, the shape of treachery hiding within protocol, and the crack in the facade where danger might seep through. "I never solved merely a theft," Holmes said as he stirred his pipe one evening. "I solved a silence that was growing too loud, and I, writing by the fire, could only nod in agreement. For sometimes the greatest victories come not with thunder, but with a whisper that prevents the storm." That evening, as the fire crackled and the last of London's November fog curled against the windows, Holmes sat with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had smoked in silence for some time, his eyes distant but focused, like a man watching a far-off procession only he could see. "At times, Watson," he said at length, "the most perilous threats are not shouted from rooftops, but whispered through corridors lined with flags and titles." "You mean Dervish?" "Indeed. He used no weapon, no force, not even deceit in the traditional sense. His craft was access. He merely stood where others were forbidden and remained unnoticed for it." I nodded. "And yet you saw him?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Because even in silence, Watson, men leave footprints. Not on the ground, perhaps, but in time, in scent, in detail. That is where truth lives." He rose, stretching slightly, and cast his gaze toward the window. "In diplomacy," he murmured, almost to himself, "secrets are more dangerous than swords, and far easier to steal." Now then, dear listener, what do you believe was Harun Dervish's greatest mistake? Was it his trust in Miss Hargrave, his arrogance in altering the clock, or perhaps his failure to realize that Holmes was always watching, even when no one else was? Let us know in the comments. What single misstep brought the spy's carefully laid web crashing down? If you enjoyed unravelling this case with Holmes and Watson, be sure to subscribe for more classic mysteries brought back to life. New stories arrive regularly, and each holds secrets waiting to be uncovered. Share this mystery with a fellow detective in your life, and don't forget to leave your theory below. After all, as Holmes would say, the game is never over. It merely awaits its next player.